Hey there folks, Aldershot here, and today we're going to do an early impression on Brigador, developed by Interstellar Jockeys, and it's on sale on Steam at the regular price at around $20 USD. Now this game is in early access, and because of that, I want to remind the folks watching that by the time you watch this video, the game could have very well been changed or updated. So I do recommend, at the very least, check out the Steam store page, just to make sure you're nice and up to date, in which all that kind of information is listed in the details, of course. Now, Brigador is kind of an interesting little game. It is essentially a isometric shooter where it involves tanks and mechs and all that kind of good stuff, right? Now, at the end of the video, we'll talk about the game's settings or options menu, as well as any extra features or bonus content that it might have to offer. But for the time being, let's just jump into a game. Now before we actually jump into the game allows you to select from a variety of different tools to your disposal, if you will. Of course you can also hit random and now randomize all your stuff. You want a little bit of variety in your gameplay. Now there are 6 available vehicles in its current state as of this recording. There are currently 2 walkers, 2 tank types, as well as 2 hovercrafts, right? And they play out very, very differently. And each of these vehicles, as you can see on the right hand side, will have their own stats, their own attributes, their own characteristics, their own advantages and disadvantages, as you would expect. For the time being, we're just going to jump into the Loyalist Tank Prowler. It's by far my favorite vehicle. It's the one I do the best with. It's kind of a medium stat build, but its special ability, if you will, a special characteristic is that I can hold the space key or the action key, and that will allow me to kind of turbo boost a little bit, right? Some other vehicles will have different special characteristics, like the walkers have a stomping ability, and some of them don't even have a special characteristic. They're just really, really fast or really high armor or something like that, right? But for the time being, we're going to use the Loyalist Tank Prowler. Like the vehicles, you also can select from a variety of different primary weapons, and like the vehicles, they will have their own characteristics, advantages, disadvantages, their own attributes, stats, all listed on the right hand side, although some of them doesn't quite have the description yet. Mainly because I'm assuming that this is still in early access. There are definitely some stuff that you'll notice that is missing as far as a complete game is concerned. But, it does fall under the early access category. So these things are kind of expected, right? Hopefully that will be filled in with future updates. I'm sure it will. But for the time being, today we're going to go with the Chain Gun 16mm AP Careless Freak, if you will. Bit of a mouthful. You can also select your choice of secondary weapons as well. And like the vehicle and the primary, their own characteristics, attributes, weakness, strengths, etc., etc. I think you guys kind of get the point, right? For the time being, we're going to choose the Howitzer. Now, this is the special. Each vehicle you'll be able to select from or at least in this case, 3 special abilities, if you will, special projectiles. You can either use the smoke projector, the EMP grenade, or the active camouflage. My favorite is the active camouflage. It's very well suited for obviously stealthier gameplay, whereas the EMP is very, very useful for more combat-oriented play styles. And the smoke projector is an interesting in-between stealth and combat. It basically allows you to create your own escape route by creating a wall of smoke to break the line of vision, if you will. However, you can also double as a tactical combat maneuver, breaking that line of vision, but allowing the players to still see the enemy and shoot them through the smoke wall, if you will, right? I personally prefer the EMP if I'm going combat, but for the time being, we're actually going to go with active camouflage, which is exactly as it sounds, It camouflages you, gives you stealth. So we're going to hit accept. And here, before we start, we can choose from which starting points that we will, start from. We're going to just go with Outer City, why not? And random, why not? Okay, here we go. So we're finally going to jump into Brigador. Alright, so the first thing I kind of want to talk about is the visuals, the graphics. I love it. I'm just going to flat out and say that I really like the art in this game. It has a very classical isometric style of graphics that's akin to, say, like StarCraft or maybe old school ARPGs. Or old school tactical CRPGs, of, you know, that variety of kind of graphics, you know. And this game does a pretty good job at kind of taking inspiration from those sorts of games. And as you can see, you know, the environment and the vehicle itself is quite very detailed. It's also very easily read for the player as well, like the visual elements is pretty easily understood. I know this is a wall, I know this is my tank, and I know kind of where the front is and where the back is because of these headlights. So they've done a pretty good job at implementing visual cues and visual clarity while maintaining, in my opinion, a high fidelity of graphical quality as well. As I mentioned before, the environments are very well detailed. I do really like the art design in this game. I'm not sure if you can hear it, but the audio is also quite nice as well. I do like the soundtrack that I'm hearing, and some of the sound effects in this game are actually quite pleasing and suiting to the atmosphere as well. So let's talk about the controls a little bit. Kind of gushed over the visuals enough. So getting used to this game will, well, take some getting used to. Because, well, for the most part, the game plays like a tank. Right? I am a tank right now, but even the mechs kind of play like a tank, where the mouse controls, you know, where your turret's facing, and the WASD key controls where your tank is facing. Kind of understanding that because this is isometric, left sometimes means right and right means left. That will definitely take a lot of getting used to. Understanding that the headlights mean the front and not the back will take some getting used to as well. When I first jumped into this game, learning to control these kind of tank controls definitely took a lot of time, but once I kind of understood it, it became very second nature, right? As you can see, the mouse does control where you're aiming with your turrets, right? And as I mentioned before, this tank, you can hold select, or not select, the spacebar, and that will allow me to kind of boost a little bit. I can hit the middle mouse button, now put me into my active camouflage. As you can see, that guy passed me right through, didn't see me. Except for these guys with the little eyeballs, they can see past active camo, so you gotta be careful about those guys. And here we go, we got some Marines. We'll just crush them and shoot them away. Just like that. So as you can see, it is an isometric shooter. You do have limited ammo count, and these are ammo stations. You can also pick up ammo from corpse of your enemies as well if they drop it. So you do have to be a little bit micromanagey, if that's a word, on how you use your ammo. That guy just dropped some ammo, so we'll pick that up by hitting the R key. Try and take care of this guy as well. I have to say though, because of the isometric view, I find aiming a little bit weird at times. Definitely takes some getting used to. Like, I feel like I'm pointing at one item and I'm shooting at him, but I'm not really. I'm just like a few degrees off. So that will also take some getting used to as well. To say the least, the game definitely has a huge learning curve, right? And it's not really catered towards the casual gamers, let's just say. It's definitely catered towards the more hardcore, the more skill-oriented gamers out there. And we'll definitely discuss a little bit more about that. But for the time being, I kind of want to talk about what's the whole point of the game. What am I doing here? Well, when I first jumped into this game, I thought it was just like any isometric shooter. Just shoot everything and make your way to the next level. Well, I was very wrong. You try and kill everything and you're not prepared for it, you will die very quickly. Like I mentioned before, this game definitely has a high skill ceiling. So the best thing to do is actually to avoid as much combat as possible, in my opinion, and to basically just go for your objective. And I haven't actually mentioned the objective yet, so I guess I should do that. The whole point of it really is to destroy the enemy's guns, their turrets, right? In which they're marked right here, these little yellow icons, and one right here, right? So you destroy 3 of those, and then you move on to the next level. In its current state, and in this very early access form of this game, There is no real story or narrative. There's no real unlocks or even a stat system for the player. It's all about endless mode. So you just kind of go through the map, killing all the big guns, and then making your way out of this map, moving on to the next level. It's all about just doing the best you can, going as far as you possibly can. And this game does feature a permadeath system. So if you die, that's it, game over, start again if you will, right? So, to say the least, the game does kind of, at least in its current early access states that I'm looking at, does kind of lack a little bit of incentive for the player to keep playing. Like I mentioned before, there's no unlock system currently, there's no story mode, there's only really one mode to play, which is what we're playing now, which is endless mode. And there's not even stat tracking for the player to keep track of. So it does suffer from incentivizing the player from, to keep playing beyond its core game mode, which is endless mode. Now, the amounts of customization and experimentation potential that this game has to offer, as you saw in the beginning with the variety of different vehicles and guns to choose from, that'll definitely help incentivize some replay in this game. But once the player kind of find their favorite gun and strategy, I do feel like it will be weakened after a little while because, like I said, there's really not that much incentive to keep the player playing outside of the game, the core gameplay itself, right? Now, luckily for us, the core gameplay is actually pretty fun. I actually really enjoy it. It's challenging. Is extremely challenging. That's why I like stealth mode, because I can just run away from a lot of the combat scenarios, which often gets me killed, right? So at least I can say that, even in its very early states, even though the game does feel a little incomplete because of all the reasons I mentioned already, the lack of story, the lack of unlocks, the lack of incentive to keep the player playing outside of experimenting. Luckily, the game is actually quite enjoyable, and the gameplay itself being enjoyable might be enough to keep some player coming back, which is good, right? Now, you haven't noticed already, the environments are completely destructible, right? Everything is destructible. The forests, the trees, the buildings, the pipelines, everything's destructible, and there's a lot of environmental hazards as well. Like if you were to bump into a pipeline, oil pipeline, and it explodes, that's going to damage you. If you go over mud or sand, that's going to slow you down. There's a lot of little tiny mechanical nuances for the player to learn, which really adds to the learning curve of this game, as well as its skill ceiling, which is, by the way, both very high. Right? This is definitely a very challenging game. I've yet to make it past level 3. I usually die at level 3 or level 2, and that's the end of that, right? Like I mentioned before, very challenging. It's definitely catering to the more skill-based gamers out there. It's not making any concessions for the casual market at all, which I'm perfectly okay with. There's definitely an audience and a market for that kind of games, and this game is definitely, I can tell, trying to capitalize on that audience. So yeah, it's a pretty enjoyable game. It's very challenging, as I mentioned before. The biggest downside, like I mentioned before, is definitely the lack of incentive for the player to keep playing. It definitely needs some kind of story mode, I think. I think it needs some new game modes to be available for the player as well. Like, currently, there's only one game mode, as I mentioned before, endless mode. I think a game like this would be extremely well suited to multiplayer. Very well suited to multiplayer. I really hope to see a multiplayer game mode available in the future, as this game is in early access, so that might be a possibility, hopefully. I'd also like to see this game have different game modes outside of endless mode. Obviously, a story mode would help, right? And just different ways to play the game. I think that would definitely help a bit of the replay. Now, the game also randomizes the map a little tiny bit, I've noticed. Not completely, I don't think, but to a degree it does have some RNG elements, which does also help with the replay, which is good. But overall, I actually really like Brigador. I like the skill ceiling. I like the challenge level. I like that it's not making any concessions to more casual players, that it really does want to focus on skill-based gameplay. The game definitely has a lot of room for tactical play, for intelligent, planning, and even the environment itself is an enjoyable little romp to go through. I like being able to kind of make my own paths, if you will, to my goals rather than just taking the main path or the main road. In fact, if you just take the main road, that's often the most dangerous path to any goal. So it's always advantageous, in my opinion, to create your own kind of back alley into any given goal, which in this case is to kill these giant cannons that we've been doing. Alright, let's see if we can take care. Oh, we just died. Okay. New contract. So we'll take this opportunity to explore some of the other vehicles. You already saw the tank type, the Prowler, which is my favorite. Let's take a look at a walker. Let's say this guy here. Accept, outer city, accept. Here we go. So I like the tank types because they're actually pretty easy to handle, pretty easy to drive, in my opinion. These walkers are a little bit slower, generally speaking. However, although he doesn't have the speed boost I was using on the tank type, if you press space, he can do a smash, as you can see. And that's really, really useful, especially when you're trying to create your own kind of back alleyway to any given goal, right? Like you saw me in the tank, I was kind of nudging myself against the wall to break through it, kind of like this. And it took a little while, but with the walkers, I can just stomp, and that will destroy the wall very quickly, which saves on time, which is obviously a tactical advantage. Now, something else about the game, like I'm gonna just walk through this wall. As you can see, or hear, it's not making any sound effects. There are definitely some assets that's missing in this game, and you can very clearly tell, right? This game definitely is in early access, and it's definitely showing a lot of signs that's in early access. There are definitely things about the game, like the missing story mode, like the missing different game modes, and the missing sound assets that really clearly states that this game is incomplete. And indeed, this game does feel very incomplete. It does feel kind of beta, if you will. Now, this is in early access, so somewhat expected and somewhat excusable, but it is something that I do want to point out to players, that it does feel a little incomplete. Now, albeit what's here already is enjoyable. I like, all the stuff I already mentioned. I like the graphics, I like the challenge level, I like the gameplay, and all that kind of good stuff. But it does feel incomplete at times, right? So do be aware of that. And that's really my main critique of the game, is that it does feel incomplete in its current state. However, with that said, I think, in my opinion, that this game is showing a lot of potential, like a ton of potential, right? The gunplay and the tank play, and the high quality graphics, and the amount of customization and experimentation potential that this game has to offer, as well as its high skill ceiling, has the potential to be, in my opinion, a cult favorite. I think Brigador has a lot of appeal to people who like, let's say, games like StarCraft, games like, I don't know, other very high skilled games, right? It's not your usual isometric shooter, right? It's all about tactical play, which is something that it does have in common with more traditional isometric tactical games. Whereas this one's obviously not a tactical game. It is an isometric shooter, but it uses the same sort of strategic planning that you might see in more tactical games like StarCraft, or maybe CRPGs and stuff like that. And yeah, it's good. I like it. I really, really do like it. However, again, it does feel a little incomplete. I would also like to see a stat tracking system in this game as well. For a game that's supposed to be so focused on essentially skill, right? Player skill, for it to be enjoyable and rewarding. Indeed, it is that. Stat tracking is really important to those kind of games. Can you imagine StarCraft not having stat tracking? Like, it's just so important for games like this to have stat tracking, so the player can learn from their mistakes, so the player can see patterns in their gameplay, What's their favorite vehicle? What's their favorite tactic? What's their accuracy rating, etc., etc., right? Like, these are essential numbers and information that the players really does require in order to improve the gameplay. And in a game like Brigador, where it doesn't even have a story mode in its current form, getting better at this game is the incentive to keep playing. So without stat tracking, that element of replayability is kind of hindered, right? So that's definitely something I really want to see in this game. So that's basically Brigador. Pretty interesting. We're going to get out of this real quick, resign. And I want to show you the last vehicle type before we exit. We're going to take a look at the hovercrafts. Accept, launch. Now these ones are really interesting in that they control very differently from the other vehicles. As you saw with the tanks and the walkers, you have to turn like a tank and all that kind of stuff, right? But with the hovercrafts, your turning is based completely on your mouse movements. They'll turn with your mouse. And A and D actually works as sidestepping or strafing, if you will. And that definitely adds a new element to your tactical play. However, the hovercrafts generally, even though they're faster, they're generally less armor. They have less armor, less HP, and all that kind of stuff, right? So you do be aware of that. However, the hovercrafts do have a stomping ability, much like the walkers, which is very useful. It's not quite as powerful of a stomp as the walkers, as that'll be the trade-off, but it's still available and something that the tanks don't have. I do like these hovercrafts, these hover types, but I find their lack of armor and hit points kind of a hindrance, even though they can move faster to make up for it. I generally prefer the tanks overall because of its speed boost capabilities, right? But that's basically the hovercrafts. Pretty interesting. You might want to give these a go when you first jump into the game because they are the easiest to control, seeing how the direction is based solely on your mouse, and you have the strafe ability, which helps your survivability quite a bit. But after that, I do recommend trying out the other vehicles. Like I mentioned before, Brigador definitely incentivizes, encourages experimentation, you know, which is great. But anyways, let's just get out of this. New contract. Back. Alright. So overall, I do like Brigador. I think it's quite an interesting little game. Let's just jump into a random game while we finish up this impression. I think it's a pretty interesting little isometric shooter. I think it has a lot of potential, and like I mentioned before, I think it has the potential to be a cult favorite because of its very high skill ceiling and learning curve, right? So it definitely has that sort of audience in mind. And there's a lot to like about it, you know. The graphics are great, the tactical play is great, the customization is great, as well as the potential for experimentation. There's a lot of little mechanical nuances, like the environment itself, learning all that stuff, and what guns best against what mobs, etc, etc. Lots of stuff to learn, lots of stuff to really dig into and master, if you will. So, yeah, I really do like Brigador. However, I can't really say I straight up recommend it currently because, well, let's admit it, $20 is a fair price tag, right? It's a pretty high price tag for a game that, unfortunately, at the current moment, as of this recording, does feel incomplete. And, you know, the lack of incentive to replay outside of experimentation and the core gameplay itself, the lack of certain assets such as crushing sounds when you break through barricades, and the lack of content, as in just one game mode, no multiplayer or anything of that sort, makes it a little bit hard to recommend at $20 in its current state. However, one thing I think I can fairly say is that Brigador is a game that is definitely worth keeping an eye on. You know, when it's more finished, when it's more complete, or maybe when it actually is complete, I think this game will be a fan favorite. I think a lot of people will flock to it. I hope, hopefully they will anyways, because if the game continues to uphold this quality of gameplay while adding more stuff to it, I really can't see a game like this fail, unless, you know, obviously it just doesn't have enough coverage, which hopefully this little impression will help with that. But But yeah, that's basically Brigador. Very good, very enjoyable, high skill ceiling, high learning curve, very satisfying core gameplay, but it does feel a little incomplete in its current states. So hopefully when this game is actually complete and finished, it will be as enjoyable as I imagine it to be, right? So that's basically it for this impression. Let's get out of this so we can kind of talk about the settings. So these are the settings right here. You got your full screen, you have your resolution, initial display, although I'm not completely sure what that means. I think it's for multi-monitor setups. Then you have VSync and directional shadows, point shadows, your usual volume sliders, and that's about it. Honestly, the visual options aren't the greatest. It's not the most robust, but it's not really a game that's going to be overly hard on your system either, so it does have that. And as far as extra features and bonus content, there is none. There is just the endless mode that we've been playing currently, and a tutorial, which isn't really a game mode at all. It's just a tutorial. So that's basically it for Brigador. Hopefully you found this enjoyable. Hopefully you guys found this informative. And if you did, you know, show me some love, like, share, favorite, comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe. I'll bring you lots more video games just like this. Thanks for watching, everyone. Alder shoutouts.